Hello and welcome to this VPAL signature event. The Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability presents Harvard Speaks on Climate Change, a new series featuring Harvard faculty working on different dimensions of the climate change. For tonight's event, Professor Megan O'Sullivan will discuss the interplay between energy markets, the global clean energy transition, and the geopolitical factors shaping the shift. Professor O'Sullivan will also share key insights from the recent COP28 summit and what these developments mean for the future of energy. Professor and Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability, Jim Stock, will host. Without further ado, Jim, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of Harvard Speaks on Climate Change. I'm Jim Stock, Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability and Director of the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard. My academic appointments are in the Economics Department and at the Harvard Kennedy School. A core objective of the Salata Institute is to drive impactful research by Harvard faculty and students on climate change, sustainability, and the energy transition. To that end, the Institute supports cross-school research on climate and sustainability topics with a focus on impact at scale. Harvard has many accomplished faculty across its schools engaged in research and thinking on the frontiers of tackling climate change problems. This monthly series provides the broad Harvard community an opportunity to learn about their work. We take you on a virtual tour of the research and engagement being done here on climate and sustainability. Each hour will focus on a specific topic featuring one or two faculty members. Today, we look at the complex interactions between the transition to a low-carbon energy future and geopolitical realities. As our guest, Megan O'Sullivan of the Harvard Kennedy School has written, until recently, the conventional wisdom held that the shift to new sources of energy would not only aid the fight against climate change, but also put an end to the troublesome geopolitics of the old energy order. She goes on to point out that we have seen over the past 36 months, however, but that has hardly been a tranquil transition, with European energy prices skyrocketing in advance of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, subsequent major disruptions in energy markets, and potentially spreading war in the Middle East, along with a Made in America approach to climate policy in the United States. Megan's the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School and is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of Practice of International Affairs at HKS. During the George W. Bush administration, she served as Special Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan. Recently, she has written a series of articles on the geopolitics of the energy transition, published in Foreign Affairs, co-authored with Jason Bordoff of Columbia University. Megan will speak for about 25 minutes, then we'll turn to open discussion. I will select or combine questions for Megan from the Q&A stream. With that, Megan, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim. And it's a pleasure to be on this platform with you. In the time that I have been in my new role as director of the Belfer Center, I've really been very excited about the actual and potential for additional collaboration between Salata and the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School. So it's a pleasure to be with this audience, many of whom I know and some of whom I don't. And as you said, what I'd like to talk about is this interplay between the energy transition and geopolitics. And I'm going to use this opportunity because this is a platform with a community of people that I can share nascent ideas with. I'm going to put forward some of my current thinking, but much of it is still very much in the works. So I look forward to feedback and questions. So my argument to you is really 4 parts, and I'm going to lay them out at the front, and then I'll walk through them in a little bit more detail. The first part of the argument, I think, is not a surprise and hopefully is not a point of major debate among this crowd. And that is that the energy transition, the move to clean energy and a net zero global economy is the challenge of our time. It is the imperative of the decades ahead. The second part of the argument says that because we've always seen this entanglement of energy and international affairs, we shouldn't be surprised that one can't pursue the energy transition without an understanding of how the geopolitical environment is affecting it. So, second part of this argument is just the geopolitical landscape that we're currently in has a major impact on the pace and the scope of the energy transition itself. The third part of the argument is there's also a flip side to this, how the energy transition is pursued. And we all know from, reading, perusing, assessing multiple net zero scenarios, we all know there are many different pathways to net zero. And which pathway we take and how that pathway is pursued will actually also affect geopolitics. It will affect international affairs. And again, that's because of this entanglement of energy, climate, and international affairs, and because of the fact that, as everyone on this webinar knows, we're not just talking about substituting one source of energy out for another source of energy. We're talking about changing how we generate, store, transport, and use energy, remaking the backbone of the global energy system, which is the backbone of the global economy. So how this is done is going to have a huge impact on global affairs. And then finally, I would say that we're in the fourth part of this argument is we're in a loop, which I would characterize as largely a negative one, where these things are affecting one another, that geopolitics are deteriorating. This is, a generalized argument, but I think geopolitics are deteriorating. This is affecting our ability to get to net zero in, on the whole, an adverse way. And our pursuit of net zero is reinforcing some of the pernicious trends in our geopolitical landscape. But the fourth part of the argument is it's all not doom and gloom. I'm not content to say we're in a negative feedback loop and we're going to continue to stay there. That if we think a little bit differently about the energy transition, we might have the opportunity to reverse this feedback loop and to think about the pursuit of net zero, not just as an ends, but also as a means. And let me just say what I mean by that. Not just as an ends, I mean, it is an end. Our desire is to get to a globally sustainable economy. But it could also be a means for addressing some of the most deleterious geopolitical trends of our time. So that's my overall argument. Let me take the remaining time I have to kind of break it down and flesh it out a little bit. So again, not going to spend time on how important this energy transition is, but move to that second part of the argument, which is simply that the geopolitical environment of today is having major implications for the energy transition. And so when I look at the global landscape, and you'll be surprised to know that I'm actually not a pessimist. But when I look at the global landscape, global politics today are, I would say, largely characterized by a series of either negative trends or transitions. And I'll highlight a few, but this, of course, they're not the only ones that are on the landscape. One is the return of great power rivalry. And that, of course, is a very significant change from the world that many of us or all of us were living in, even say 10 years ago. That the period between the end of World War I until, let's say again, 10 years ago, was perhaps unique, but it certainly was unusual because it was a period that was a relatively benign international environment. And it was one where we had conflict, of course, in many parts of the world, but there was the absence of great power conflict where you would have the death of 10, 20 million people. So in that period of time, we had, again, a benign international environment, which actually made it more possible to pursue energy security, and I would argue was the best opportunity to pursue climate security. But now we're in a very different environment where the possibility of great power conflict is real, and great power rivalry and competition is unquestionable. So how is this affecting the energy transition? Again, I'll be brief, just given time, but also given that some of these examples I think are fairly straightforward. One is just that in this environment, energy has once again become weaponized. And we saw that in Russia's invasion of Ukraine very clearly. That, perhaps people expected Russia to use its energy in an even more cutthroat kind of way. But simply the reality that Russia had such leverage over Europe meant that the reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine was greatly tempered. And if you think about that, it was actually the invasion almost 2 years ago in February. It took until December 5th before Europe decided that it could no longer import Russian oil. And it never actually banned the import of Russian gas, even though there is much less flow between Russia and Europe, mostly for Russia's effects. So again, we've seen that this return of great power rivalry has increased the use of energy as a weapon in foreign policy in a way that we hadn't seen for quite some time. Secondly, second example under the great power rivalry is, of course, the relationship between the US and China, which has become perhaps the most competitive relationship in the world and unquestionably the most consequential relationship in the world. And this competitive dynamic between the US and China has already had a significant impact on the energy transition. And if we think about it just in terms of the replication of clean energy supply chains that is happening around the world. And the fact that this competition has meant that across a range of goods, not just ones related to the energy transition, both the US and China have decided they don't want to be so mutually dependent. Of course, when it comes to clean energy supply chains, this is much more a problem for the rest of the world because of China's dominance in these clean energy supply chains. So we see this phenomenon of recreating supply chains or an effort to recreate supply chains. And this, of course, could make the energy transition simply slower and more expensive, but hanging over it, and I would say getting more and more attention really every week and month, is the prospect that China's dominance, particularly in critical minerals, could end up being exploited and becoming a component of competition with the US and even Europe in a way that could pretty significantly not stop the energy transition, but slow it down or again, make it more expensive. So again, looking to other dynamics in the international system that are affecting the pace and scope of the energy transition, I'll point out one that maybe isn't at the top of your list, and that is the rise of middle powers. So middle powers is kind of a vague category of countries, but if you think about the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, you'll get a list of countries will pop into your head. And these were countries that largely said, we didn't want to be in one camp or the other, and we're going to try to just remain independent of this great power competition. Today's competition between the US and China is also bringing forward a lot of countries that don't want to be asked to choose between the US and China. But these countries are not as, they're not really on the sidelines of global politics, and they're certainly not on the sidelines of the energy transition. They're countries that maybe can't challenge a power like the US or China or Europe on every dimension, but on individual dimensions, they can be extremely influential. And we've already seen that coalitions of these middle powers have had an impact on the climate talks, as we saw just in Dubai a few months ago, but also, over the last couple of versions of the climate talks. And if we look at some of the language that these countries were interested in putting into the communiques or generally informing the global approach to the energy transition, they include words like equitable and just. And of course, those words are not objectionable on their own. Nobody would advocate for a transition that wasn't equitable or wasn't just. But at the end of the day, there is concern, I'd say legitimate concern, that those words will be later pointed to as ways of slowing down the transition. Similarly, Saudi Arabia is like a classic middle power, and some other OPEC countries, I think, fall under this middle power concept as well. And we can see that they have a role in advancing the energy transition, but also in slowing the energy transition. And as they are more willing to play an independent role in the conduct of their foreign policy, less amenable to pressures or requests or entreaties from the United States in particular, we can see that when the agendas are not aligned on the energy transition, this can have global implications. So the third element of the global order that I'll highlight is just the growing rift between the global south and the developed world. And this, I think we could see it clearly as coming into sharper relief in relationship to things that have very little to do with the energy transition. The response of OECD countries to COVID, the relationship or the perceptions of hypocrisy that are really rampant around the war in Ukraine and now the war in Gaza. And other crises having to do with food and inflation, all of these things have driven a wedge between the developed world and the global south, or the developing world. And this, of course, has major implications for the pace and the scope of the energy transition. Because as we know on this call, sitting here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, not someplace sunnier and greener than you would think, but that in fact, 88% of the emissions that are going to be emitted in the future are going to be from outside the United States. So just how this part of the world, this entire, billions of people are approaching the energy transition will matter a great deal. And if they feel that the energy transition is perceived to be a Western agenda, this obviously complicates and slows down our ability to make a transition. Okay, so that, again, that was the second part of the argument, just looking at the trends in the global international environment and how they're affecting our ability to get to net zero and clearly to get to net zero in a way that brings the whole world along. The third part of the argument, as I mentioned, was thinking about how the energy transition is affecting global politics. And here, as I mentioned, this is because of the dramatic nature of the energy transition. And my feeling for quite some time is that this transformative effect on geopolitics, the energy transition on geopolitics, is in some strange way almost independent of how close we get to net zero by 2050, whether we ever get to net zero, just the sheer attention and focus that companies, countries, foundations, other entities around the world are putting on getting to net zero is having a huge impact on the shape and the scope of foreign affairs. So let me just say a couple of things about how the energy transition could be, I would say, exacerbating some of the trends that I just mentioned. So I talked about the great power competition, frustrating the energy transition. I think we can also see how the energy transition is playing into that great power rivalry. And let me just say again, returning to the war in Ukraine, that this was the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine was against the backdrop of an energy transition that was disorderly. So we had, because of a lack of investment, we're talking in investment before 2021, but my head is in the fall of 2021. And what we were seeing is a mismatch between supply and demand and in favor of producers. And it was that mismatch that gave Vladimir Putin such geopolitical leverage in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine and right after the invasion of Ukraine, because Europe was actually already in an energy crisis, not of the extent that it was after the invasion, but before the invasion. It was already in an energy crisis because Russia had already begun to withdraw supplies from the international natural gas markets, exacerbating what was a disorderly transition because of the difficulty of really synchronizing drawdowns in supply with drawdowns in demand. What we were getting is constricted investment going into fossil fuels, but still growing demand for fossil fuels. And that created leverage again for geopolitical actors. So as Jim said, as he introduced our session today, we might think that a world of net zero is going to be a lot more copacetic. And that I think very well may be true. But in the interim, in that transition from here to there, there's going to be a period, potentially quite a long period, where Jason Bordoff and I have termed it a feast before famine, where traditional producers of oil and gas actually are going to have incredible amounts of geopolitical power because of the way that the transition is handled. Now, another thing, I mentioned this middle power phenomenon. And I would say that, well, I'll put that a little bit to the side because this is a point that affects not just middle powers, but other countries as well, that the energy transition could further diminish the power of interdependence. So we're talking about a growing fragmentation of the global order. And, we could debate whether it's deglobalization or whatever word we want to use. But I think what we can point to is that the world is less economically integrated today, maybe than it was yesterday in certain respects. And we're certainly away from the age where every passing month or year, the world was more economically integrated. And the energy transition, I think, has the ability to contribute to that trend. And let me just take the statistics around trade that the International Energy Agency points to about what will happen to global trade and energy over the course of this transition. So their statistics and their modeling suggests that in 2050, the world will have only 38% of the energy related trade that it is on the trajectory to generate by 2050. So we actually are going to have far less global trade for the size of the economy than we would have expected to have, because the importance of trade and oil and natural gas are going to go down considerably. And this, makes sense because if we go through the transition, and as we expect, it results in the great electrification of so many segments of our economy more than it is today. We know that 2/3 of oil and gas is actually transmitted across international borders, where a few years ago, the number for electricity was closer to 2 to 5%. So again, just many more countries will be meeting the energy needs of their citizens through energy that is produced at home. And even the trade that does exist in the energy world is going to be very different. It's going to have a lot more of trade in critical minerals and other clean energy components than, of course, it will in oil and gas. So again, we could see that an energy transition could reinforce the trend away from global economic integration. Finally, the example of the developing world and the developed world. And here I think this is fairly self-evident at this point, but obviously the pursuit of the energy transition has the very real prospect, and I would say already has, provided more friction in that relationship between the global South and the global North, or the developed world. The sense of injustice and the sense of hypocrisy that I mentioned are really, they come into very sharp relief around the energy transition, where it is that developing countries are feeling that they're being asked to curtail the development of their own resources in order to for the world to meet its climate goals, and the sense that they are bearing some of the worst effects of climate change, but have the least responsibility for the carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So again, everything I said up till now is basically trying to make the case that we're in a little bit of a pernicious cycle where a deteriorating global landscape is frustrating our ability to make an energy transition as quickly and as cheaply as we would like. And the pursuit of the energy transition, which will continue to be relentless, is reinforcing some of those negative geopolitical trends. So anyway, here's the part where I tried to be a little bit more optimistic. Still a lot of thinking and work to be done. But again, getting to this idea, could the energy transition be an end want to get to net zero. That's the objective, but also a means that the tools that we use, that we decide upon, that we build, and we construct to pursue net zero, could they be ones that rather than exacerbating the global situation, they in fact improve the global situation. So let me just give you a sense of some of the ideas in my head now where this might be the case. I would be thrilled if you had ideas that were triggered by this presentation, because I think there are quite a few places where this might be the case. First, I would say I talked about the diminishing integration of the global economy. Of course, we've got a value judgment here. There may be some people on this call who say, why are we assuming that is a good? In my mind, this has been an important vehicle for poverty alleviation and growth around the world. So what I'm interested in is the extent to which the energy transition can support a more open trade agenda. So pushing back against a trend towards more protectionism that we see, both apart from climate and related to climate. But is there a way that actually the imperative of the energy transition can help policymakers move away from an increasingly entrenched view that trade is something that is hard to support domestically? Here, I'm talking a lot about US policymakers in particular, because this is not obviously a global phenomenon, although I do think the protectionism bent that we're seeing in the global economy is not limited to the United States. So what are a couple of ways in which this might happen, where the pursuit of the energy transition could advance a freer and more open trade agenda? First, I think, is in the whole friendshoring phenomenon, where you see clean energy supply chains being relocated outside of countries where they've existed for some time, and the imperative that many policymakers and others feel this has for the energy transition. Now, this, I think, when we look at the investments that we are interested in countries making in order to diversify these supply chains, I think there's a very legitimate case for many of these countries and companies operating within them to say, you'd like us to make billion-dollar investments in mining and production and processing of these minerals, but the uncertainties around the markets are pretty significant, and this is an obstacle anyway, but certainly the idea of market access is one that matters a lot. So if these countries want to or can be encouraged to make such investments, to develop the supply chain, to be another source of clean energy inputs, they probably, not probably, I'm confident, they're interested that in market access to the American economy, to other economies, knowing that this is going to be part of the overall package and a successful effort to actually develop those kinds of supply chains outside of China and other locations. Another trade initiative, which I think makes a lot of sense in the context of the clean energy transition, but is harder to sell for the non-energy components, is just this idea of an environmental goods trade agreement, which of course has been pursued by a number of countries without success for quite a long time. But the argument to bring down tariffs around environmental goods and clean energy inputs, I think, is an incredibly strong one across geographies. And again, one that can push in the opposite direction of the trend towards protectionism and fragmentation that we're seeing. A second area where I'm hopeful that the energy transition can kind of start to reverse this cycle if we pursue it in a conscious way is how can the clean energy transition better be a spur for development in the global South? This is something that I think a lot of people are working on, thinking about. Obviously, it's the goal, but I've been struck in my conversations, both in COP and recently in Davos and in other places around the world, that often when we talk about increasing climate finance, that is not always viewed as the most the positive conversation that I think many of us intend it to be. In the developing world, often there's the perception of saying we'd like to increase clean energy finance so countries in the global south can be better positioned to buy manufacturing and other goods produced in the United States and in Europe and in Northeast Asia. And in fact, that's what some of our politicians are saying to domestic audience. So it's not surprising that developing countries would say that's not of great interest to us. What is of interest, and what I think is the direction that we want to pursue a clean energy transition that will be both an ends and a means, is a transition that uses the imperative of getting to net zero as also a vehicle for what one of our colleagues, Ricardo Hausman, calls green growth. So can we use clean energy finance to help countries actually build new platforms, new areas of manufacturing, so that they can become important nodes in the overall clean energy system, rather than just purchasers of technologies that are manufactured and developed elsewhere. And so staying on that point about the energy transition being a vehicle for better, more equitable development, I also think another element of this friendshoring conversation and movement has to do with standards. And we see a lot of concern that the rush to capture inputs in the clean energy supply chain could lead to a race to the bottom. We see lots of concerns, legitimate concerns about child labor and other factors being used to actually develop, mine, and process some of these critical materials. But in the effort to, again, develop supply chains elsewhere, employing the financing that will need to be included in a way to uphold standards that have to do with labor and environment and other things, I think can be a net benefit to many of these developing countries as well. And then finally, let me end with just some thoughts on how the imperative of the energy transition might be helpful in navigating the great power rivalry that is in front of us and likely to be part of our reality for some time to come. So first, there's the US-China relationship. And I would say when I wrote my last book on energy and international politics, now 5 or 6 years ago, more than that, I was hopeful that cooperation around climate could be a kind of a real beneficial node in the US-China relationship, and that it could change the fundamental character, or it could change some of the character of the overall bilateral relationship. I'm less sanguine about that now, given the last 6 or 7 years and the deterioration in the relationship that we've seen between Beijing and Washington. However, I do think that given common interest, not exact interest, but given common interest in climate and in the environment and in the transition, that both Beijing and Washington will continue to have an interest to work together in some fashion. I don't think it will be transformative. I don't think we should bet everything on the transition, on that relationship improving. But I do think that the areas and the avenues of cooperation and collaboration on climate and on the energy transition between the US and China, at times in the future, may be some of the only contacts that are still standing. So they become very important, not just for climate, but also for the peaceful navigation of this relationship. And then just lastly, a similar example, when we think about the US and Europe and Russia. Again, with regret, but with some confidence, I look at the next decade, and I think that the relationship between the United States and Russia is likely to be a very frigid one for the next decade, assuming that Vladimir Putin continues to be in power. And so in that regard, it will become very important to grasp any avenues where we can maintain some form of relationships or contacts or over the course of the next decade that may bode well for the overall relationship in a period of crisis. And so certainly cooperation and coordination around the Arctic for managing issues that have to do with climate and conservation in the Arctic in a very technical sense, again, could be one area where those linkages could be maintained and again, might have value for the broader relationship and peace and prosperity over the coming decade. I'm going to stop, Jim, and look forward to any comments or questions that you or our colleagues have.
That's fantastic. There's a lot to unpack in that, and we have a large number of questions in the Q&A stream. I have some of my own, but I think that what I'm going to do is probably interject mine in the context of this discussion. So I'd like to start out with a pretty high level question, but a really important one from our colleague, Jim Engel. I'm just going to read this. Great powers have frequently jockeyed for power. Energy and supply chains have periodically been weaponized and almost surely will be in the future. In order to help maintain geopolitical stability or improvement, do you believe that global production of oil and gas will need to be as large in 2045 as it is today? Increased, decreased? Do you believe that global increase or decrease in production of oil and gas will be entirely dependent on geopolitical events? Big question.
Yeah. Let me think about this.
Forecasting is hard, by the way.
Yeah, forecasting is hard. And again, here's the challenge of separating aspiration from analysis, which in the case of the energy transition, my first reaction to the idea that global production of oil and gas will be in 2045 as it is today is pretty sobering. So to me, I don't think, the Jim ended with a question about is the production of oil and gas going to be entirely dependent on geopolitical events? And I'm not sure exactly what he means by that, but I think, geopolitics will remain important. But I think we see a variety of things happening in the energy market landscape that suggest geopolitics will be one of a number of factors, but that I see plenty of reason to believe that a lot of producers are already the consequential producers are already trying to situate themselves for an energy transition in which the world will be consuming significantly less oil and gas, but at the same time, still a certain amount of oil and gas. And that the geopolitical implications of that, I think, are that these countries will have more geopolitical power, but that doesn't mean that geopolitical power will come from the volume of oil and gas they're producing. It will come more from the fact that they're producing more of the overall pie, even though the pie is smaller, if that makes sense. And I think, Jim, you and I have talked about that a little bit. I think I agree with his point that energy and supply chains are almost, well, I don't want to say certainly, are very likely to be weaponized over this period of time. I mean, even in December, we saw that China, probably in reaction to some of the constraints and export controls that the United States put on semiconductor chips export to China, we saw China say, we're going to put limitations on the export of technologies to process rare earths. And of course, China has a huge advantage, dominance of the processing of rare earths, and putting a kibosh on the export of that technology to other countries is going to make it harder for other countries to replicate those supply chains and to diversify their supply chains around China. So it's not just that we're going to see it weaponized. I think we're already seeing it be addressed in the context of politics. But that is what a lot of these new policy initiatives have been trying to prepare for.
I guess just to follow up a little bit on this supply chains, and we've talked about this before, I think it's important, and I know you know this, but just as a general statement, it's important to differentiate between what we might think of as concerns about OPEC control over oil prices and then potential disruptions to supply chains for example, particular things that were the minerals that would go into electric vehicles or components that would go into batteries. And the difference is, of course, that if suddenly oil prices are $120, we're all paying for it at the pump today. Whereas if all of a sudden lithium prices quadruple, that's going to affect the purchasers of new EVs. But the EV that I own, I'm still going to be able to drive it around, and it's not going to affect my pocketbook at all. So there's this substantial difference, which makes me kind of wonder a little bit more. I certainly understand the international or geopolitical rivalry or the great power rivalry part of the supply chains. I get that. But in terms of the actual economics of energy security and the supply chains, I find myself struggling a little bit with that part of the argument.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, maybe it's because I'm either not making it clearly enough or, well, I'm not arguing that these things are the same because, as you point out, they're very different. One is, can bring a global economy or national economy, not to a standstill, but, can have an immediate effect on it. And what you're describing is the reality of this situation, which is more the effect on inputs. And so I've been quite conscious in using the words slow down and make more expensive. And that's distinct from curtailing, stopping, those are different words and they refer to a different level of threat. I still think that it is of geopolitical concern. I know I've had conversations with our colleagues about, well, if China made all the refrigerators in the world, would that be a strategic problem and those types of things? But I do think that it is of strategic concern whether one country has the ability to slow down and increase the cost of the energy transition. And if you look at what the impact will be on just say the American economy of a curtailment of minerals that make it difficult to make additional electric vehicles, particularly in a future where we see electric vehicles permeate the markets a lot more, this could maybe, not affect every consumer in a daily basis kind of way, but it could be very, very consequential for the American auto industry, which is a very important industry in the United States. And you think about President Obama in the auto loan rescue and these are things that matter. They don't constitute the end of an era, don't throw America into a recession, but they do matter to our economy. And I think when we look back after not post COVID, I'm still reluctant to use that word, but if we think about after COVID, the slowdown in supply of chips and how that affected our economy, it had an effect.
Yeah.
So again, I think your distinction is very important. It just doesn't lend me to think it's insignificant. I think it just has to be put in a proper context.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a number of other there's a lot of interesting questions. Let me just turn to a point raised by Roger Schimmel in the chat, but then I'll expand on that a little bit. So Roger asked a question about the EU border adjustment mechanism, which is currently going into effect. I think the first reporting period for that is at the end of this month.
Yeah.
So that's starting up. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that applies to all importing countries. There is the argument in favor, the reason for our carbon border adjustment is that the European Union has a system in place, the emissions trading system, which actually has quite a high carbon price, and that covers manufacturing industry. So for example, steel. If that tax on carbon is paid for by the steel industry in the EU, if you don't tax the imports, that disadvantages the Europeans and it disincentivizes using a carbon price to reduce emissions. So they put on a carbon border adjustment. How do you think this plays out? The question is like in international relations, how is this playing out? And then, of course, we're doing a different sort of thing, which is subsidizing a lot of domestic production through domestic industrial policy and then the various sourcing supply chain issues here. So we seem to have these activist policies that are affecting international relations. And what are the pluses? What are the downsides? What's your analysis?
Yeah. No, there's a lot there, and thank you for laying that all out. I remember when I first heard about the carbon border adjustment mechanism several years ago, when it was an idea, I thought it sounded fantastical, but here it is on our doorstep. And it does have geopolitical implications. I think on the one hand, what we are seeing, and I'm cautiously optimistic that this can be done well, is that countries are trying to kind of harness the competition that is the dominant dynamic in today's global politics, trying to harness that to advance the transition. So rather than hoping that cooperative mechanisms can be the way in which everything gets done through common agreements, there's now much more an element, and this is reflected in industrial policy that is flourishing not only in the United States, but in parts of Europe, but certainly in Northeast Asia and other places. On the carbon border adjustment mechanism, I think you described it very well, and that this is seen largely as a way of flattening the playing field from the European perspective. It's saying simply, we just want to even out the advantages so that there aren't other countries that have advantages because they don't have a tax or a price on carbon being able to undercut European manufacturers. And so, this is the big question. Is this actually WTO compatible? Probably not, but, there's a big back and forth about that. So I think the question that Roger was asking, like, well, is this going to slow down things or is this going to expedite things? And you asked, implicit in that question is just like, what is this going to do to geopolitics? Right now, there's, as many people know, enormous concerns in many parts of the world that this is going to be a major impediment to trade and growth in parts of the world that don't have a price on carbon. So I foresee that this will become an issue of friction between the EU and many developing countries, as well as the EU and the United States. There's already been a whole number of conversations about this, efforts to try to see if we can integrate this, at least when it comes to certain sectors. And those thus far haven't been successful. But I do see, like, the argument that this could expedite the transition is if this carbon border adjustment mechanism becomes an impetus for other countries to put a price on their carbon. And that, I think, is there's first the domestic focus, just even the playing field, don't be disadvantaged. Europe obviously very concerned about its competitiveness and its pursuit of an energy transition is affecting its competitiveness. But there's this other component of, can this actually be used as an impetus for other countries to to implement a price on carbon? And there, I think there is some scope for the CBAM or other things to be initiated and executed in a way that is a little bit more inclusive, in the sense of being coupled with assistance, technical and otherwise, to countries that are looking to get there, but maybe need help getting over that hurdle. And so I think that is on the minds of many Europeans, and whether or not that can be realized in a way before the rest of the CBAM. The CBAM is like, they're collecting data right now, but the penalties are not going to be enforced, I think, until much later in the year.
All of that makes a lot of sense. In the United States, there's different legislation that's proposed. At least some of the legislation or some of the arguments suggest that we could put on a carbon border adjustment just based on the fact that we have a lower greenhouse gas footprint than our rivals, which is, I think, the WTO argument for the European position, because they actually really do have a price there, is maybe fairly strong from what I understand. It's a little bit, it requires a little more legal creativity to say that we can do the same thing even though we don't have a domestic carbon price.
Right.
But I guess that's why we have international lawyers.
Who knows? I live in hope. I live in hope that we'll have a price on carbon one day.
There's an interesting question, switching gears a little bit. There's an interesting question. I'm going to pronounce this last name wrong, Raphael Monge, who asks about hydrogen. And so there's over just the most recent period of time, last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a real uptick in interest as about building out green hydrogen projects, including in Saudi Arabia, which I think is on track to build the largest one in the world. If where clean electricity, solar and wind conglomerates are able to use electrolysis to produce hydrogen, and then that hydrogen can either be used directly for generation through combustion, or it can be used as an input into something like creating clean fuels or clean ammonia, and ammonia could be used for different purposes. So that's with the background. And the question is, does hydrogen, or the assertion is that hydrogen holds the promise of enabling countries to become more self-reliant in their energy production. Given this shift, how do you foresee the geopolitical landscape evolving? Specifically, could the widespread adoption of technologies like hydrogen significantly alter global power dynamics by reducing dependence on fossil fuel exporting nations? So there's a lot there, a lot there. OPEC, it turns out, also is like it's not just the OPEC of oil, it's the OPEC of sand and wind and sun. But how is that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you again. You're great at this, Jim. You're giving all this like really important context to these questions. So, I would say that I put myself in the category of I am hopeful that hydrogen at least holds out the prospect that countries that have not been energy superpowers at all, but have been very dependent on imports of energy, will actually be able to meet their own energy needs, and in some cases actually be able to be producers of hydrogen that will supply probably more likely a global ammonia market than a hydrogen market. Because one of the things that you didn't mention, Jim, of course, is that hydrogen is difficult to transport, but if you make it into hydrogen and make it into ammonia, it's a carrier for energy, and there actually is already somewhat of a global trade in ammonia, although nothing to the scale that might develop over time as green hydrogen potentially becomes a lot more economical. And I'll just give you a few examples of people that I have spoken with over the last year or two in countries that have a lot of hopes and, some reasonable expectations that they may be able to be power sources for this. And because, of course, as your reference to Saudi Arabia suggested, what you're looking for is a country that has access to a really cheap renewable energy that can actually be used to generate the green hydrogen. And so if you look at a map, there are places, obviously Saudi Arabia, potentially one of them, but another one, I actually had a conversation with a student today about this, is Nepal. Nepal has huge amounts of hydro energy and hydro potential. And they've just signed a contract looking in to develop green hydrogen with the ambition not just to meet Nepali energy needs, but the ambition of actually providing a lot of energy needs to India and beyond. Namibia is another country, again, has fantastic offshore wind power potential and is interested in potentially being a big global supplier of green hydrogen. So I think there's still a lot to be done, as I think the question suggested, that there's still a need to bring down price. There are big concerns about transportation, but I do think that it offers a certain number of countries an interesting potential path to greater prosperity. And I do think it will influence, if it is successful, I think it will really influence the geopolitics of energy, because we will actually, I gave some numbers about trade. They're not anticipating that there's a big global trade in ammonia or hydrogen. But if that were to happen, then we might see some of the geopolitics around natural gas or LNG be somewhat replicated in the geopolitics of clean or green ammonia.
I'm really glad to hear you say that. And that, I mean, there is this vision. And it's the one I started off by quoting you, is there's this vision that we'll be transitioning to a world where everything is generated by photovoltaics, and we're going to be good, and we'll have
And I'll be out of a job.
you'll be out of a job. But the reality is that for the foreseeable future, like for decades, if there is green ammonia that becomes a viable international product, or if there's power to liquids through hydrogen or any of these channels, they're going to be competing with fossil fuels, and they're going to be competing with each other, which means there's going to be one big global market for fuels that are produced in one way or another. Are they drilled? Are they done through hydrogen production? Are they done through, whatever? But if there is one big market for these fuels that are competing with each other, then they're going to be just as we're going to be just as vulnerable to those international prices disruptions, whether or not we're doing that domestically or not. So I think it's an open. I would just say that there's an argument to be made that it's an open question. And here, I've been reserving my hard question for you. And this is going to be a lightning round because we're just at the end. And you might want to duck it. This is a hard question. Just this week, there's been rumors that the Biden administration might put a pause on increasing new LNG export, liquefied natural gas export terminals, which have been a major part of, which have expanded in a major way, in which there's been a lot of international provision and movement in natural gas, and especially provision backstopping Europe during the decrease in Russian natural gas. What are your thoughts about the international aspects of this particular proposal?
Yeah. So I'll try to be
And you
brief.
can duck it if you want.
No, I don't. I don't have any reason to duck it. I'm not in politics anymore. So it's a really interesting development. Very briefly, what I would say is, at first I was really surprised by this because of the really central role that American natural gas has played in the energy security, and therefore really the security of Europe over the last couple of years. However, this is all to be seen in the domestic political context, in the context of an election year, where I think we do see President Biden, wanting to ensure that some of his more progressive supporters are comfortable with his energy policies, and particularly after some earlier decisions, I think there's a sense that there needs to be reassurance. So I think it's highly likely to happen. That's my political estimation. I think it's a bigger question about whether it really has a major impact on global LNG markets, because if you look a few years out, we're actually talking about a lot of new projects coming on. So I don't know that it's going to specifically have a deleterious effect on LNG trade. Where it will have an effect, and you intimated this, is on geopolitics, in the sense that you put it in the context of a situation where for months the US Congress has been sitting on a $61 billion request to provide military and economic support for Ukraine. And I think there are real question marks around when that is going to pass and get out of Congress and get to Ukraine. And you put this move in the context of that, which will be perceived as, a threat to potentially European economic security. And I think it sends an overall really negative message about, in an election year, about American support for the war in Ukraine. So I think geopolitically, it will be quite negative. I think it's generated by domestic electoral politics. I think on markets, the impacts will be less than it sounds. How's that for lightning?
Thanks, Megan. That was great. So I really appreciate that. And we need to wrap this up. So thanks, Megan, so much for this thought-provoking discussion. Thank you for the Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning for your production support. Our next episode is on Wednesday, February 28th, and it will feature Harvard Graduate School of Design professors Holly Samuelson and Jonathan Grinham, who will discuss green building design in the age of renewables. Thank you, audience, for joining us, and let me now turn it back to our VPAL hosts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan and Jim. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us for more signature events. Information about upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, can be found at vpal.harvard.edu/vpal events. Thank you and good night.